I was 27 years old when I took what I thought would be one of the easiest jobs of my life, a temporary overnight security assignment at an abandoned prison in the Midwest known as Creek Correctional Facility, a place I had never heard of before and honestly didn't care to learn much about at the time, because the pay was good, the hours were quiet, and I was told very clearly that nothing ever happened there. The prison had officially shut down in the late 1980s, supposedly due to structural instability and budget cuts, and according to the company that hired me, the building was owned by the county but left in use while paperwork and funding disputes dragged on, which meant my job wasn't patrol or interact with anyone, but simply to sit in a small monitoring room near the front entrance from midnight until 6 in the morning and keep an eye on a handful of aging security cameras that still worked in certain sections of the facility. There were no inmates, no staff, no maintenance crews, and no reason for anyone to be inside the building at night. And I remember being told during orientation that if I heard noises or thought I saw movement, I was not to investigate unless an actual alarm was triggered, because the place was old and prone to settling sounds, loose metal, and wildlife getting in through cracks in the outer walls. That first night started exactly how they said it would. Quiet, uneventful, and honestly boring, with the kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, the hum of old electronics, and the ticking of a cheap wall clock that hadn't been replaced since the prison closed. The monitoring room itself was small and windowless, with peeling paint, a folding table holding 6 black and white camera feeds, and a single overhead light that flickered just enough to be annoying without ever fully going out. And I remember scrolling on my phone, sipping burnt coffee from a thermos, and counting down the hours until sunrise. Around 1 in the morning, I started to notice how cold the room felt, even though the weather outside wasn't particularly bad, but I brushed it off as poor insulation and pulled my jacket tighter. At exactly 1:40 a.m., something happened that broke the routine and still stands out of my mind more clearly than anything else from that night, because one of the camera screens flickered and stabilized and a small red indicator appeared in the corner of the monitor, signaling detected motion on camera 6. At first, I didn't react, because false triggers were common, especially in old buildings like this. But when I looked closer, I felt my stomach tighten, because Camera 6 was assigned to cell Block C, a wing of the prison that was completely sealed off after closure due to heavy structural damage and asbestos contamination, meaning there were no active power lines running through it, no accessible doors, and no official reason for that camera to still be functioning at all, let alone detecting movement. I leaned closer to the screen, expecting to see static, a shadow, or maybe a rat running across the floor. But what I saw instead was subtle and somehow worse, a slow shift in darkness, like something tall passing in front of the camera just out of frame, followed by a faint change in contrast that suggested depth, not random motion. I checked the timestamp to make sure the feed wasn't looping old footage, but it was live, updating in real time, and when I glanced at the other monitors, everything else was completely still. I remember telling myself that the building was old, that wires crossed, that maybe the system had been misconfigured decades ago and nobody bothered to fix it. But there was a growing sense of unease I couldn't shake, because I knew enough about the layout of the prison to understand that cell Block C shouldn't be capable of movement detection at all. I considered calling my supervisor, but there was an unspoken pressure in security work not to overreact, not to be the guy who panics over nothing, especially on a temporary contract. So instead, I did what I probably shouldn't have done and continued to watch the monitor. For several minutes, nothing happened, and just as I started to relax, the motion indicator flashed again, this time staying on longer, and I noticed something new that made my chest feel tight. The camera angle hadn't changed, but the shadows on the floor were different, as if whatever caused the movement hadn't left the area, but was standing just outside the frame, close enough to affect the light without fully revealing itself. I felt a sudden, irrational urge to look over my shoulder, even though I knew I was alone in the monitoring room, and that was when the quiet stopped feeling empty and started feeling occupied, like the building itself was paying attention. I told myself I would give it 5 more minutes, and if the sensor triggered again, I'd log it as a malfunction and move on. But deep down, I already knew that whatever was happening on camera 6 didn't feel mechanical or random, and as I sat there watching that unmoving, grainy image of cell Block C, I had the uncomfortable realization that this was the first time all night I truly felt like I wasn't alone in that prison, even though I had no logical reason to believe anyone or anything was actually there. After watching Camera 6 for what felt like far longer than it probably was, I finally convinced myself that sitting there imagining things wasn't helping. And despite company policy advising against unnecessary investigation, I decided to take a flashlight and physically check the corridor leading towards cell block C, mostly so I could reassure myself that nothing was actually wrong and log the incident as a false alarm. The walk from a monitoring room to that wing of the prison took me through a series of long, narrow hallways that were lit only by emergency lights mounted high on the walls, most of them dim or partially dead. And the further I went, the colder the air became, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, uncomfortable way that made it feel like the building was breathing out. I kept telling myself that old concrete structures hold cold, that this was normal. But there was something off about the silence, because it wasn't just quiet. It was flat, like sound didn't carry properly, and my footsteps felt muted even though I knew I was walking on bare concrete. When I reached the entrance to cell block C, I stopped short, because the heavy steel gate that was supposed to be permanently sealed with welded bars was standing open just wide enough for a person to slip through, and I remember feeling a brief spike of irritation mixed with relief, thinking maybe maintenance crews had been here earlier and nobody had bothered to update the records. I stepped through the gate and immediately noticed a smell, a stale metallic odor mixed with dampness, like old water that had been sitting too long. And as I swept my flashlight across the block, the beam revealed a row of cells stretching down the corridor. Each door closed and locked, their surfaces pitted with rust and peeling paint. Except for one, Cell 11 stood open, its door swaying slightly back and forth on its hinges, moving slowly enough that it took me a moment to realize it wasn't caused by air circulation, because there was no draft, no ventilation, and no sound of wind anywhere in the building. I called out, identified myself as security, and my voice sounded wrong to my own ears, too thin, like it was being absorbed by the walls instead of echoing back. And when no one answered, I took a few cautious steps forward, trying to ignore the tight feeling in my chest that told me I shouldn't be there at all. As I got close to cell 11, I noticed scratch marks along the inside of the door frame, deep gouges in the metal that looked too deliberate to be simple wear and tear, and for a brief, unsettling moment, I wonder how a place that had supposedly been abandoned for decades still showed signs of recent damage. I leaned slightly to shine my flashlight inside the cell, expecting to see debris, maybe an animal nest, but the beam cut out completely, flickering once before dying in my hand, leaving me standing in near total darkness broken only by the faint emergency lights behind me. I stood still, listening, suddenly acutely aware of my own breathing, and that was when I heard it. The sound of footsteps directly behind me, close enough that I could tell they were matching my stance, shifting weight when I shifted, stopping when I froze. I didn't turn around right away, because some instinct told me that whatever was behind me didn't want to be seen, and that acknowledging it would make the situation worse. But the pressure of its presence was overwhelming, like someone standing too close in an empty elevator. I swallowed and spoke again, louder this time, asking if anyone was there, and that was when I felt something leaning toward my right ear, close enough that the air moved, and a calm, flat voice spoke, so clearly it didn't sound imagined at all, saying, "Lights out was at 9, in the tone of someone correcting a minor rule violation. The words didn't make sense in the moment, but the authority in that voice did. And before I could react, the emergency lights flickered violently, plunging the cell block into full darkness, and I heard a series of soft sounds coming from the surrounding cells, not banging or yelling, but something far worse. Gentle knocking, slow and patient, coming from inside the locked doors, one after another, as if multiple people were trying not to draw attention to themselves. My radio crackled to life in my hand, but instead of a voice, it emitted a burst of static so loud it made me flinch, and through the noise, I thought I could hear faint breathing that didn't belong to me. Panic finally took over, and I turned and ran, my shoulders slamming into the open gate as I bolted down the corridor, the knocking behind me growing faster, more urgent, following my movement rather than staying in place. And as I ran, the hallway seemed to stretch unnaturally, the exit lights appearing farther away with every step, like the building was resisting my attempt to leave. I didn't look back, but I could feel something chasing me, not at a sprint, but at a steady pace, completely confident it didn't need a hurry. And just before I reached the main corridor, I felt a sharp tug at the back of my jacket, hard enough to nearly pull me off balance, followed by a sudden release, as if whatever had grabbed me had decided to let go. I burst through the last set of doors and didn't stop until I reached the front gate of the prison, my lungs burning and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. And when I finally turned around, the corridor behind me was empty, silent, and exactly the same as it had been before, as if nothing at all had happened. I stood outside the prison gates for several minutes trying to slow my breathing, telling myself over and over that panic can make ordinary situations feel unreal, that adrenaline distorts perception, and that nothing I experienced had to mean anything supernatural. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, the feeling that something had followed me out of cell block C wouldn't leave, lingering like a pressure at the base of my skull, that made it hard to think clearly. Eventually, training kicked back in, and I forced myself to lock the outer gate, return to the monitoring room, and finish the rest of my shift, even though every instinct I had told me to leave and never come back. The cameras were all normal when I sat down again, including camera 6, which showed cell block C exactly as it should have been, sealed, empty, and completely still, with no motion indicators, no strange shadows, and no signs that the gate had ever been open at all. I checked the system logs to see if anything had been recorded during the time I was down there, but there was nothing. No motion alerts, no power fluctuations, no record that camera 6 had even been active during that hour, which didn't make sense because I was absolutely certain I had watched it trigger more than once. The rest of the night dragged on in an uncomfortable haze, and I jumped at every small sound, every pop of old wiring or distant creak of settling metal, convinced each time that I was about to hear that voice again. But morning eventually came without another incident, and when my supervisor arrived to relieve me, I tried to explain what happened as calmly and professionally as I could, sticking to the facts and leaving out how it made me feel. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable, then told me something that made my stomach drop in a way I still remember vividly. According to company records, there was no overnight security position at Red Creek Correctional Facility. Not currently and not ever, because the building had been classified as too unstable staff after its closure, meaning my assignment should not have existed in the first place. I laughed at first, assuming there had been some kind of clerical mistake, but he pulled up the contract database to show me, and my name wasn't attached to Red Creek at all, despite the fact that I had badge access keys and signed paperwork. When I mentioned cell block C, and specifically cell 11, his demeanor changed, and he told me that the original blueprints for the prison jumped from cell 10 to cell 12, skipping 11 entirely, something he claimed was a common superstition-based design choice in older buildings, though he couldn't explain why I would have seen or entered it. I quit on the spot, not angrily, but with a kind of numb certainty that staying involved with that place in any way was a mistake, and for a long time afterward, I tried to forget the entire experience, convincing myself that stress, isolation, and suggestion had combined to create something my mind filled in on its own. But forgetting didn't work, because the effects followed me home in subtle ways at first, like an inability to sleep with the lights off, or the constant habit of checking corners and doorways before entering a room. Things I told myself were temporary. Then the dream started, always the same hallway stretching farther than it should, always doors on either side with gentle knocking coming from behind them, not desperate, not violent, just patient, as if whatever was inside knew I would eventually have to decide whether to open them. Sometimes I would wake up to the sound of static, convinced my radio was going off, only to realize I was alone in my bedroom with nothing but the hum of my own thoughts filling the silence. The worst moments came late at night, when the house was quiet and the lights were off, and I would hear a voice from somewhere just out of reach, calm and familiar, reminding me that lights out was at 9, spoken not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, like a rule that had always existed whether I agreed with it or not. I moved apartments twice in the following year, changed jobs, avoided anything related to security work, and refused to talk about the prison with friends or family, because I knew how it would sound, and I didn't want to see that look in their eyes that says they're humoring you. What finally pushed me to accept that something truly wasn't right happened months later, when I received a piece of mail with no return address, containing a single black and white photograph of a prison corridor that I immediately recognized as cell block C, even though I had never seen any photos of it before, and written on the back in faded ink were the words, "Shift starts at midnight," followed by a number I recognized as my old employee ID. I never found out who sent it, and I never went back to Red Creek, but I know with absolute certainty that whatever enforced the rules inside that prison never stopped doing its job, and sometimes When I lie awake staring at the ceiling with every light in the house turned on, I get the unsettling feeling that I didn't escape that night so much as I was released, and that one day, when I finally forget to leave a light on, someone will be there to remind me that the rules still apply.